Excellent, and thank you. So I have the honor of introducing the Telecoms section, the third section of today. And I think it's worth remembering that you really need fundamentally strong telecom networks to deliver on a lot of the exciting things we've talked about this morning, whether it's broader digitalization, AI, streaming. A healthy society needs strong telecom networks. And I sort of want to reflect on what we've seen in the last 12 months since we were last here together. I think the first theme I want to pick up on is we've had some management changes in the sector. We have two new CEOs in big seats. We've got Margherita and Alison that will be on the platform shortly. But we've had management changes at Telia and incoming management at Telenor. And then the management teams at Orange and Telecom Italia have been in since 2022. So we've got a new set of leaders coming through, which I think might change some of the perspectives on the market. I want to focus on really just four M&A developments in the last 12 months that I think are a healthy indication of where the sector is. Number one, Vodafone, one of the kind of cornerstones of the sector, is now motoring through its M&A strategy. Has announced the sale of its Spanish business to Zegona that closed on Friday, is in flight in Italy, and as we all know in the UK, is in the middle of a large JV transaction. Number two, KKR has acquired the fixed infrastructure of Telecom Italia. That's a 19 billion euro transaction pre the earnout. We're still in a world where infrastructure funds and pension funds are pricing digital infrastructure assets ahead of where the stock market is, despite the high interest rates. And I think we'll see that coming through. Number three, we've seen the emergence of Middle Eastern investors coming into Europe. Etisalat or EAND has bought 15% of Vodafone. Saudi Telecom has bought 5% of Telefonica. And I think that's another indication where external capital, external operators see deep value sitting in European telecom that's not yet reflected in the stock markets. And number four, I just think an interesting and curious development is Xavier Niel and Iliad has emerged as a sort of consolidator of minority stakes, bought significant stakes in Tele2 in Sweden, in Proximus, in Vodafone, in Millicom, a smart industrial investor buying up the sector. And yet the public markets have share prices languishing at sort of flat. The average incumbent is flat on the last 12 months. So I sort of want to unpick why is that, and what is the bull case for telecom, and why I would expect we see some real share price appreciation in the near term. I think there is this paradigm where telecom got stuck when it went ex-growth. When it went ex-growth, natural for many companies, they levered up and committed to big dividends. As you pay big dividends, the shareholders that bought telecoms, the investors that bought telecoms are income funds, principally, dependent on the dividend. The sector then got hit by two concurrent capex trends. You had 5G and you had fiber. And all of a sudden, cash flow comes under massive pressure. Dividends get cut. You're already relatively levered because when you went ex-growth, you levered up. And you get stuck in this negative feedback loop where it's very difficult to invest further capex, very difficult to grow, it's very difficult to remunerate your shareholders. And if you look at the 5-year history of some of our biggest telcos, they've drifted with very poor share price performance. And ultimately, capital pulls out of the sector when you have a dynamic like that. So the question now, I think, is what needs to happen going forward to get a more buoyant and a stronger telecom sector going forward? I think, number one, you need a macro environment that is stable and constructive. And I think one of the mistakes of the past is we've had attempts to consolidate, but generally, the remedies imposed have potentially, arguably, eaten the synergies, made it very different to create an environment where you can drive return. But I think the bull case is largely predicated on this point that we are now past peak capex. And I want to give you an example to explain why I think the sector will deliver a much better cash flow to its investors in the next 2 to 3 years. If you take the average incumbent telco, I think you'd see most of them with about a 35% EBITDA margin business. And if you've got capex running high because you've got to do 5G and you've got to do fiber, capex to sales historically run north of 20%. So very crudely, 15% of your revenue is going to cash flow. Roll forward, and even if you assume no growth, if you get copper decommissioning, estimates vary, but you might collect 5% more margin there. You then go to a 40% EBITDA margin business. Once you've rolled your fiber networks, and if you look at Southern Europe, Telefonica is very advanced. They're now guiding to capex to sales of 10%. You suddenly have 30% of your revenues converting to cash flow. So you go from a world where we've been at 15% revenues going to cash flow to 30%. You double cash flow. And that should lead to a re-rating in the sector and allow more investment, more shareholder remuneration, and a healthier, vibrant sector. Now, it doesn't necessarily happen like that, because the risk is the past prevails. We have deals put through incredibly difficult remedies. We have a fragmentation that remains, and we have pricing that remains anemic. And investors then pull out of the sector, and you get less investment. So my sense is that we are closer to the bull case today, where we're through peak capex, that we should see some motoring. But I think the investor community is deeply skeptical. It's very much a show me, not a tell me. And I'll finish by saying we've got Julian and Margarita on next. We've got Mike Fries coming after that, Alison after lunch, and then a mobile and a fiber panel. And I hope that through that process, I'll give you a sense, we'll get a sense of conviction that actually we're now approaching the times for a bull case in telecom. With that, I'd like to invite Julian to the stage.